right, we'll go ahead and continue shifting to social and emotional development during adolescence. Really quickly, I just want to point out kind of a content warning. So towards the end of this, we will talk very briefly about suicide. So if at any point you feel like you need to leave, that's completely fine with me. We're not going to get graphic or anything. It'll just kind of come up as a topic. So just want to let you know that. All right, so in terms of adolescence, we're going to first talk about Erikson's stage, and we will see that for adolescence, kind of the main focus during this time is on discovering an identity. We'll also talk about how social aspects are changing, so teens now are really focused on friendships and romantic relationships, really shifted away from the family in a lot of cases. And then we'll talk a little bit about how moods and emotions are also being influenced by puberty, by all those hormonal changes. And that can lead to, all kinds of tumultuous moods, which can also increase rates of things like depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts. Okay, so starting with Erikson's psychosocial stage. This stage is often referred to as the identity crisis. So if you've ever heard that term, identity crisis, this is where that comes from. And the crisis here, according to Erikson, is between identity versus role confusion. So having a sense of identity means knowing who you are, what your values are, what direction you're trying to take in terms of a career or family, etc. Knowing things like your sexual orientation, having an ethnic group that you can identify with, a political party, etc., religious beliefs. Identity encompasses a lot, right? Because it's based like what makes up who we are. So adolescents who have a strong sense of identity will come out, feeling committed to a lot of these different aspects of their identity. We'll get more into that in just a second. Those who fall on the side of role confusion are more likely to have a lack of direction. They may feel kind of aimless, like they have no idea what they want to do with their life. They might lack self-definition and kind of rely on other people to tell them who they are. They tend to be less prepared for adulthood. And usually this is the result of having really restricted choices in childhood and in adolescence. So let's get in a little bit more to kind of the process of finding an identity. So here we have kind of these four different, you can think of them as like different stages of identity development. But you don't necessarily need to go through these stages in order, and people can often bounce and forth from one stage to another. And you also got to keep in mind that we're doing this all the time for all aspects of our identity. So you could be in multiple of these stages for different aspects at a given time. So just keep all that in mind as I start to talk about it. But these stages come from the levels of exploration that a person has done and the level of commitment that they have now come to in finding their sense of identity. So let's talk about career choice, just to have some example to make this a little bit more concrete. So let's say you're in adolescence, you're in high school, you're trying to decide what career you're going to eventually pursue. Identity achievement is where you have taken lots of time to explore all the possible career options. You've thought about it, you've weighed all the benefits and everything, and you've committed to something. So someone who's in identity achievement, they're both high in exploration and high in commitment, okay? Someone who is in identity moratorium, they're more in that exploratory phase and they haven't committed yet. So maybe they're still doing the research, still looking into it. They just haven't yet come to a decision. So in general, I would say identity achievement and identity moratorium are kind of where you want to be, probably in adolescence, according to kind of the ideas we just talked about with Erikson. You either want to be exploring your options or you have already explored them and you've kind of settled on something. These other two stages tend to have less ideal outcomes. So identity foreclosure is where you have not taken the time to explore or really consider all the options, but you've gone ahead and committed to something anyways. Usually identity foreclosure happens because someone has sort of like forced an identity upon you. So that could be like a parent figure or a teacher, so maybe someone has parents who both their parents were lawyers. And so they just kind of expect that their kid is also going to be a lawyer. And so from the time the kid was born, they've been talking to them as if like, this is just your predestined outcome. This is what you're going to do. So then when that kid gets into adolescence, they don't even take the time to think about other career options. They don't research them. They're just like, well, I guess I'm going to be a lawyer. That's what I'm doing. And they commit to that. The other end is identity diffusion, which is where you've done no research and also you're not committed and you're not really exploring or looking for other alternatives. People who are in identity diffusion, they often just kind of like they just, they're to the wind. They let the fates decide what's going to happen to them. In terms of a career, they might just kind of oh, whatever's easiest. I see that there's a job posting on this restaurant I just walked into. I'm going to apply and get this job. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, I'll find something else. So they're not really exploring. They're also not committed to something. They just kind of let fate or other people decide what's going to happen for them. So again, according to Erikson, ideal place to be is in those top rows. You want to kind of avoid giving into those bottom rows. And again, I just want to reiterate, so someone could be in identity achievement for their job. They figured out, okay, I want to be a professor, I'm going to pursue that, I'm going to do that, but they're still in identity moratorium when it comes to their political beliefs or whatever. And again, you can kind of jump back and forth. Maybe, this mostly applies to adolescence, but even in adulthood. If the education system just collapsed right now and I lose my job and I can't be an instructor somewhere, then I'm probably going to go into identity moratorium, try to figure out okay, what's another career option, and then go back to achievement. So. Okay, but main thing is identity development is kind of the key thing that's happening during adolescence. Again, something you all probably have experienced. It's a pretty big deal in high school to try to figure out what group you fit in with and what music are you going to listen to and what clothes are you going to wear, and all of that is really top of mind for most adolescents.
It's not a phase, Mom.
Yes. All right, let's move on to talk a little bit about more societal or social factors. So let's talk a little bit about development of moral understanding. I probably should have brought up Kohlberg maybe earlier, would make sense, because then we could go through these stages as we talk about the earlier years, but that's okay, we can go through it now. So Kohlberg basically developed this idea, kind of like we've talked about with these other stage theories like Erikson or Piaget or whatever, but this is for moral understanding. So again, the idea is that you develop kind of through these stages over the course of a lifetime. One of the ways that Kohlberg has kind of tested this idea to come up with these different stages is to give people these moral dilemmas at different ages and see how they respond to these moral dilemmas. So I'm going to read you one of these just to show you what I mean, give you an example. So this is one of the dilemmas Kohlberg might have created. So it says, a woman is dying from cancer. Doctors have created a drug that could cure it, but they're charging 10 times the price of what it costs to make it. The sick woman's husband went to everyone he knows to try to borrow money, but he couldn't gather enough. He tried negotiating with the doctor to pay less or pay later, but the doctor refused. So to save his wife's life, the man broke into the doctor's clinic and stole the drug, and his wife was cured after he gave it to him. So that's the kind of dilemma that he would give, and then ask, was the man wrong for stealing the drug? Should he be punished? Why or why not? So you'd give people these different kinds of dilemmas at different age ranges and see how they respond to the question. He's not so worried about the actual response, right? If someone says, oh, he was wrong, that's not the important part. It's more the content of why they think he's wrong or right and how they sort of reason through that as they're processing these different moral dilemmas. So people who are in stage 1, no matter what response they give, they tend to focus mostly on punishment and obedience. They tend to have a very rigid way of thinking of things. They find it really difficult to consider more than one viewpoint. And so as they're reading that paragraph, they usually will identify with one of the people in the paragraph and just kind of look at it from that perspective and not consider the multiple perspectives. So that would be stage 1. Stage 2, they might be able to consider multiple perspectives, but they tend to believe that people make decisions purely out of self-interest. So they don't really believe in the idea of altruism. So they might say that the husband should save his wife, but for like selfish reasons, so that he can have his wife with him as a companion or whatever, because he likes spending time with her. Stage 3, people usually start to use what we often refer to as the golden rule, like the idea that you should treat other people how you want to be treated, which sounds good in theory until you realize that everybody's different, and the way that I want to be treated is probably very different from how you want to be treated. And if you tell me you want to be treated differently, I should do that, even if it's different from how I like to be treated. So it's still a very simplistic view of the world, basically. In stage 4, they're really focused on maintaining social order. So they tend to believe that laws are important for that reason. So they might say that the husband was wrong, even though he saved his wife, he violated a social order. And if everybody did that, then like society's going to collapse and fall apart. Stage 5, people tend to think that rules should exist for the good of everyone. And if they are, for the good of everyone, then people are going to be more likely to follow them. And then in stage 6, they are able to differentiate between universal morals and personal morals. So knowing that there are some things that are like right and wrong for everybody. There are other things that I think are right and wrong but shouldn't apply to everybody. So you just, you see kind of this development of more sophisticated ways of thinking about morality as we get through this. Let's see. I don't really have age ranges for these, partially because, really anybody could fall into any of these levels at any point in time. Even adults might refer back to pre-conventional levels, stage 1 and 2. According to Kohlberg, whenever he's done these kinds of studies, he's given these moral dilemmas to people, measured their responses, etc. He finds that most people in adolescence and up into adulthood tend to fall into about stage 3 or 4. So that's kind of the highest level that most people typically get to, and that it's very rare to actually see someone who's in stage 5 or 6 levels of moral understanding. So it kind of seems like for most people around adolescence, you get up to about that stage 4 level of thinking, and that's about the max that people can reach. So because of that, I would say stages 3 and 4 reflect kind of moral maturity. And then 5 and 6 are almost like going beyond that, basically. All right, so moral understanding is developing to some extent. Let's look some more at changes in social dynamics that are going on. So we saw in middle childhood, we were starting to have this kind of like, the child is starting to pull away from the family, focus more on children. In adolescence, that is really amplified. Adolescents really are striving for autonomy. They get to a point where they want to have full control of their lives. They will push back, if a parent is trying to exercise any sort of control whatsoever. They also tend to de-idealize their parent around this time. So up until adolescence, a lot of people look at their parent as like this perfect role model, as if their parents can do no wrong. They feel like their parent is like the epitome of what you should grow up to be. Around adolescence, that starts to change. So adolescents tend to realize that like their parents are flawed human beings just like everyone else. All right, throat's starting to hurt. So evidence suggests that, around this time, authoritative parents tend to take this approach of really trying to balance like connection and separation. So they will, accept the fact that, my teenager is growing up, they're building up their autonomy, they're going to eventually go out and do their own thing. So it's okay to give them some space, let them make their own choices and suffer the consequences of it. And then whenever they are spending time together, they tend to focus a lot more on quality of time instead of quantity of time. So the authoritative parent is not very likely to try to force their teenager to spend lots of time with them. But when they do get to sit down and have dinner together or whatever, they're going to really focus on making sure that that time is meaningful, that they're connecting in a positive way. But regardless, whether the parent is authoritative or not, there tends to be lots of conflict between parents and adolescents during this time. Part of that is just, like living with another person is hard. Having another person who has laundry and dishes and food preferences and, wants to watch movies or listen to music or whatever is very difficult. And when they're younger than an adolescent, the parent has a lot of control over some of those aspects. And as they get into teenage years, there's just going to be conflict. And there's evidence that that conflict might actually be healthy for a few reasons. So whenever adolescents have conflict with their parents, first of all, it gives them an opportunity to practice resolving conflict, because that's going to be a part of life no matter what. Once they, move out of the house onto their own, they're going to have conflict with friends and coworkers and neighbors, etc. So just getting an opportunity to practice healthy ways to resolve conflict is very helpful. But it kind of signals to the parent that they need to adjust their parenting style a little bit. Up until this point, even an authoritative parent is going to have, control over their child. And so that conflict kind of signals like, hey, it's time to back off and give me some space, give me more autonomy. There's also some evidence that we actually have kind of evolved to have this mentality in adolescence of like rebelliousness and conflicting with our parents, because then it sort of forces us to move out on our own and, make our own way instead of staying in the household. So conflict is normal, in some cases healthy, as long as it's dealt with appropriately and as long as the parent, like I said, is focusing on quality instead of quantity of time. Yeah.
I find that really interesting because you see that in like the packs as well.
Right.
When the offspring start to get to sexual maturity, then you start to see them have more spats over who gets what of the kill and just the general pecking order, what's appropriate behavior with each other or not.
Right.
And that usually leads right up to them leaving the pack and breaking up and finding their own.
Yeah. We see that in a lot of like primates too that are social and have those social hierarchies that they have a very similar like.
Yeah, but primates are weird. I don't like them. They're in the uncanny valley for me.
They are a little bit, yeah, like too close to humans, but not quite.
They are, and they're evil. They're capable of evil, and that's frightening.
Yeah. I like primates. I think they're very interesting, but I see where you're coming from. Okay, so there's a shift away from family, like I said, to focusing a lot more on friendships and romantic relationships. So in adolescence, the friend groups tend to get smaller and more tight-knit. So through like elementary and middle school, you may have had like bigger groups of friends, but they weren't quite as close. So you have fewer best friends, basically. During this time, the values tend to be placed on intimacy, like having a real connection with another person, being able to be vulnerable with them, share things with them that you wouldn't share with other people, having mutual understanding and also loyalty, like friends that will stand up for you. So friendships are really the most important relationships during this time. They can help the adolescents with that whole identity development. So friends are a good source of like exposing you to other ways of thinking, trying to settle on a particular identity. I'm just looking through, making sure. I have a lot of notes, but a lot of it's stuff that I've already said, so I'm just trying to find. We tend to see some gender differences in the way the friendships are forming. It's kind of like you were saying earlier, Valerie, kind of relates to that. So girls tend to get together mostly just to like talk. So they might have sleepovers or, get lunch or dinner together or whatever, but they're mostly just sitting around talking about themselves, their lives, other people, etc. Whereas boys tend to more get together to share some kind of actual activity, like playing a game, playing a sport, playing video games. So their hangouts are more centered around like doing something. There are also some risks to friendships as well. So friendships can really amplify a lot of that risky thinking that we talked about earlier. So, through like peer pressure, for example, particularly if the risky behavior becomes wrapped up in the identity, right? Like if my identity is that I'm a stoner or whatever, like I'm going to go smoke weed with my friends every day after school, and that's like part of the identity of the group, then it can be very, very difficult for, even if an adolescent doesn't want to continue doing that, even if they recognize the harms of it, it's hard to then pull away from that friend group and like strip that part of their identity. So if friends are exaggerating the negative aspects and those risky aspects, then they can actually have, negative consequences. Let's see. Oh, another risk of friendships is what's called co-rumination, which is where you kind of amplify the negative aspects of people's lives in a different way. Like if you have a friend who's complaining that, oh, I hate school, it's so boring, it's, the worst or whatever, then your friends you might get into a cycle where they're repeating that back to you and amplifying that, and then maybe you decide to drop out of school or something like that because you've been co-ruminating with your friends about how negative something is.
So it's kind of like negativity feeding negativity? Or?
Yes, yeah.
Oh.
So in addition to friendships, romantic relationships also become much more prominent and important during adolescence compared to the earlier times in childhood. So I think we kind of talked about this before, but romantic relationships can start in middle childhood, but they're often very shallow and status-based. So, in late elementary school or middle school, it might be like, oh, I held hands with this boy, so now he's my boyfriend. And that's as far as it goes. They barely even know anything about each other. They don't really share activities. It just so happens that this very shallow thing created that. Relationships in middle school can also sometimes be really status-based. People might just have a boyfriend or girlfriend because it makes them look cooler or more interesting. So once we get into adolescence, it shifts to be these sort of deeper, more intimate romantic relationships that are likely to be longer lasting. They're motivated by things like intimacy, like I talked about before, being able to be vulnerable with a person. Compatibility is also very important. So sharing values, sharing beliefs, etc. And then also just the social support that comes with a romantic relationship is important as well. The parental attachment style, which we talked about a while ago, can influence the kind of quality of these romantic relationships. So adolescents who have a secure attachment to their parents are going to have the most positive outcomes, the most secure relationships. Those who have, I'm trying to remember all the attachment styles we talked about. There's the avoidant attachment style. If they have that one, they're much less likely to have committed monogamous relationships. They may instead just kind of date around, date someone for a week here and then another person for a week there, and not really commit to a relationship. So attachment styles can affect the, romantic relationships of adolescents. By age 18, 80% of adolescents report having had a partner in the past 18 months. So a huge majority of adolescents will have a significant relationship by the time they graduate high school. 80%. Although again, I need to put years on every stat that I have because I always forget. But I know that was probably again from mid to 2010. And I know I've been reading a lot that rates of relationships have actually been going down. Again, probably due to COVID stuff. All right, so shifting from social development to emotional development. So moods and emotions during adolescence are, like I said, very tumultuous, and there's a few reasons for that. One is just the hormonal changes. So all those sex hormones that we talked about, both the androgens and the estrogens, have impacts on the emotional structures in the brain that basically make it so that we're just more emotional essentially during adolescence. So we tend to experience emotions with a much more intensity. They feel more intense but also longer lasting. And they can be triggered much more easily than they would have been in childhood or than they will be in adulthood. I would also say in addition to those hormonal changes, keep in mind all the other stuff we talked about. The lack of sleep, the limits on time, the fact that you're having conflict with parents. There's just so many things going on that create this kind of storm of moods and emotions during adolescence. So depression and other mood disorders become commonly diagnosed around this time. So that would be things like depression, bipolar disorder. Also anxiety disorders become much more common during adolescence. Major depressive disorder is the most commonly diagnosed mood disorder during this time. About 15 to 20% have at least one major depressive episode during adolescence. And it's much more common in girls than boys, so about twice as many girls will have a major depressive episode compared to boys. Although some of that might be cultural differences in the way that we express and understand emotions as well. So, for example, a common finding is that girls are more likely to cry when they're angry compared to boys. And so the way that boys and girls express emotions can be very different. So boys might actually experience depression just as often as girls do, but it doesn't appear visibly the same way. They might vent those emotions more through anger instead of sadness, so that might be part of the difference, in those gender differences of diagnoses. I should also mention just a little bit about depression. So, most of us, when we think of depression, we probably mostly think of like the sadness as part of it, which that's an aspect of it. But depression also has lots of other symptoms. One of the biggest symptoms of depression is loss of motivation. So someone who's depressed, they have difficulty just motivating themselves to do things that most people think of as simple. They might find it hard just to get out of bed and take a shower, for example. So there's a real lack of motivation. They also tend to not find pleasure in the activities they used to enjoy. And they also tend to have kind of a hopelessness, like this feeling that this is how it's always going to be. There's nothing I can do to make it better. So it's not just sadness. There's these other parts that make depression, at least diagnosable major depressive disorder. There's the other parts of it. Yeah.
So I understand pretty much how like dopamine works in the brain, but what about like serotonin? Because I know that it's like when you have to take a medication for depression, it's like a serotonin reuptake.
Yes, yeah. So I would say dopamine is more like a short-term feel-good, right? Whereas serotonin is more mood, like your long-term sort of sense of well-being. Yeah. So serotonin contributes a lot to that like motivation that I was talking about. So oftentimes depression in adolescence goes untreated because parents and teachers kind of look at it as like, okay, you're sad and you're complaining that you maybe don't feel great, but this is just a phase. It's just normal teenage development. It's just your hormones. It'll get better or whatever. So depression is often left untreated. And when it is, that can result in a more persistent depressive disorder. Persistent depressive disorder, I'm trying to remember the cutoff. I want to say it's 2 years. So in order to be diagnosed with persistent depressive disorder, like in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, you have to have symptoms for at least 2 years. So, if it's left untreated, you're more likely to eventually end up with that diagnosis. And then also, severe depression can lead to thoughts and acts of suicidality. So that's probably the most dangerous outcome of these mood disorders. Let's see. So, kind of interestingly, even though I said girls are twice as likely to be diagnosed with depression as boys, boys are 4 times as likely to commit suicide if they have depression. So they're much more likely to act on it compared to girls. Substance abuse is one of the risk factors of suicide. So adolescents who are using substances are more likely, again, to attempt suicide. Let's see. We can talk a little bit about prevention efforts. I'd say the biggest prevention effort is just knowing the signs. And, if a friend or someone is suffering from depression, then encouraging them to get treatment, or, talking to their parents to encourage the parents to try to help them to get treatment. Just providing support. If a friend is going through a difficult time, being there to listen to them, help talk them through it, etc. There's, of course, all kinds of like telephone hotlines, suicide prevention hotlines that either you can call or suggest a friend to call. Schools and communities are having more programs to, try to promote this kind of information. There is some pretty good evidence, too, that gun control legislation does limit the suicide attempts. That's one of the common routes that especially boys take. And so limiting just access to firearms can be really impactful. So I would say those are all the main prevention efforts. Treatments like medication and therapy have been shown to be very effective in reducing particularly suicidality. They might not reduce all the symptoms of depression, but they are particularly effective for that one specific symptom. Okay, starting to end on a very heavy note. That's all I've got for today. Any questions about social or emotional development?